Much of what I've described here doesn't do justice to just how explosive this meeting was. You had Ukraine's ambassador literally wincing and having to put her face in her hands during this time. Trump represents a departure from the neoliberal world. His actions are more in line with realism or realpolitik, a philosophy we haven't seen explicitly practiced in the United States since the days of Nixon and Kissinger. Realists believe in spheres of influence. In stark contrast to liberals, they believe that the rules can only be upheld by the strong and powerful. So most of you by now will probably have seen the confrontation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky. The scene took place in the Oval Office on Friday, the 28th of February 2025. Zelensky had come to obtain security guarantees in the hope that he could protect his people from his longtime adversary, Vladimir Putin. Trump said he'd be willing to offer some guarantees if Zelensky could sign a deal giving away much of his country's natural resources to the United States. Short of there being a physical confrontation, the meeting couldn't have gone much worse. Zelensky attacked JD Vance, suggesting how his lack of experience gave him a limited understanding of Ukraine. JD Vance hit back, claiming how it was disrespectful for the leader to come into the Oval Office and litigate the matter in front of the American media. The meeting reached crescendo when Trump sided with JD and began hammering at Zelensky for not having the cards and playing with World War III. The situation unfolding before us is a clash between two competing ideologies, one that dominated the old world and one that foreshadows the new. It is, of course, very many other things as well, and I will get into these things shortly. In part 1 of this video, I'm going to go into the history and explain how we got to our present situation, and then in part 2 of this video, I'll explain the clash between Zelensky and Trump and why this represents the clash between liberalism and realism. But before we dive into it, do make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. World Order covers all things geopolitics. I also produce stories where I take famous geopolitical figures and retell their tales as epic works of action, adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, and opera. So do hit the bell icon so that you stay up to date with all of that. Without further ado, let's dive into it. So there was a time when the world was deemed fit for democracy. Back in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, many believed that the world of great power politics was over. The United States was believed to have triumphed, not only because of its capitalist culture, but because of its love of democracy, freedom of speech, and rule of law. Throughout the course of a neoliberal era, America undertook a policy to spread such a system to the rest of the world. Countries were believed to be capable of salvation only if they followed the liberal democratic US model. Less developed world dictators that challenged the United States were easily displaced or removed of. All of these people fell because the United States was the night watchman, and it was the one who would take you down no matter where you were. The United States ruled fearlessly and went to extreme lengths to sustain its neoliberal project. Coups were launched to shift countries from one system to another. But as it's historically been, many of these coups were launched not for democracy, but to ensure the spread of US capitalism. This may be a video for another time, but the neoliberal project may have fallen short because it ended up relying too much on the capitalist aspect of a liberal democracy, maybe at the expense of all the others. The project received its first initial shock in 2008 with the global financial crash. This hurt people financially, but the system was far from over. Bush left and Obama came in, and the project was given a new start. Obama took many of the policies undertaken by predecessors such as Clinton and Bush and took them even further. In 2011, he hit Libya with the goal of spreading liberal democracy in the region. This of course fell apart, and Obama could be said to be partly responsible for the creation of ISIS, a group that sought to challenge US supremacy in the globe. This is also a time when Putin began challenging in America more explicitly. In 2015, Obama sponsored troops against Assad and sought to displace the dictator of Libya. Putin sent bombers to fly in and help the dictator stay in power. This entire 2010s era is an interesting one. You still have US supremacy, but not with the same universal subscription that it had in the 90s and early 2000s. This is a time in which China is rising, and this will also throw a spanner in the works in the years to come. But liberalism would receive its first nail in the coffin with the voting of Brexit and, more significantly, the election of Donald Trump. Trump came in and complained about the neoliberal project. He claimed, rightly so, that it had left many Americans behind and put the interests of the world ahead of the interests of America. He sought to displace many of the project's deep state agents, but with mixed success. In 2020, Trump was voted out, and neoliberalism saw a brief return under Biden. But Trump returned, and his second administration looks likely to place the second nail in the neoliberal coffin. His second term has been met with praise, much more than his first. Trump has even converted former neoliberals such as Marco Rubio to his cause. The man, once an adherent of the liberal democratic world, personally asked Zelensky to leave the meeting on Friday. He admitted in a recent interview that the world had shifted from one of unipolarity to multipolarity, with nods to China and to some extent Russia as new poles of power. But let's bring this back to Trump versus Zelensky, and let's explain why this clash is one between the old world of liberalism and the new one of realism. Now, on the one hand, Trump isn't particularly ideological. Many argue that he is more driven by his own selfish needs than anything else. Others will point to mercantilism, and perhaps a better title for this video would have been liberalism versus mercantilism. Mercantilism is basically the belief of putting profit ahead of everything else. The reason many associate Trump with this philosophy is because of his alleged willingness to get involved in Ukraine if the country was willing to give up much of its resources. But if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, we could boil this interaction down to liberalism versus realism. At the heart of liberalism is a fundamental respect for democracy and property rights. No one right now embodies this movement more so than Zelensky, who fights for his country to have democracy and to be free of Russian aggression. On paper, liberals respect a country's right to self-determination. They believe that there are rules and that all countries, regardless of capability, must follow these rules for the good of the whole. This is at least true for the others that share their values. And not even that. I mean, if anyone who's actually studied history, you'll notice that the US hasn't hesitated to overthrow democratically elected leaders either when it served their interest. History has shown us that liberal democracies can be just as harsh on autocracies as anyone else. But at least on paper, the liberal movement, perhaps championed most fervently by Obama and then today by Zelensky, fought for a world of democracy, rule of law, freedom of trade, freedom of speech, and freedom of movement. Liberals believed that the world could be made more peaceful and more prosperous if everyone followed these rules. But for realists, this isn't the case. Trump represents a departure from the neoliberal world. His actions are more in line with realism or realpolitik, a philosophy we haven't seen explicitly practiced in the United States since the days of Nixon and Kissinger. Realists believe in spheres of influence. In stark contrast to liberals, they believe that the rules can only be upheld by the strong and powerful. Taken to its extreme, realists believe that the strong will survive and that the weak will perish. Ideals matter little to these thinkers. Take the Russia-Ukraine example. A liberal will look at it and say how Putin is evil. He's going against the rule of law and invading another country. A realist will look at it and say, well, look at this from Putin's perspective. As leader of Russia, his priority is the defense and the security of Russia. If America teams up with Ukraine and allows it to join NATO, well, then this would allow the US to place missiles and weapons and vehicles outside of Russia's doorstep. As a realist, I sympathize with this view, and whilst my heart goes out to Ukraine, I've often asked my friends whether they doubt the United Kingdom would do anything differently if Russia teamed up with Wales and began sending missiles and tanks into that region. Do you not think the UK would respond similarly to Russia? We know from history that America did respond similarly to Russia. And when the Russians sent missiles to Cuba in the early 60s, we had these two countries almost go to nuclear war over it. Trump is now approaching the Ukraine crisis from a more realist perspective and asking what is in it for him and how Ukraine can further America's interest. He sees hypocrisy implicit in the liberal way of thinking. Even under the neoliberal era, America did have its own sphere of influence. I mean, look at the amount of bases it has in the world. Look at the amount of countries it dominates with its companies. America and Russia both do the same thing. They're both imperial powers. It's just that America's more subtle about it. They'll conquer countries through their businesses and through enterprise and in a softer and more gradual way. Russia is much more explicit with it. Russia will send in tanks and men and do it in a more militaristic way. And America's done that too, by the way. It's intervened militarily, but not with maybe liberal democracies. You know, America did it to people like Saddam, whereas Russia's doing it to like a country that wants to be a liberal democracy, and this is why it's such a big story. This is why it's so controversial. You don't attack other liberal democracies. That's the golden rule, apparently. There is no white knight watchman anymore. There is no dark knight that resides over all the other countries to make sure they behave. For a long time, this was the United States. It was the Dark Knight. It was the Night Watchman watching over all these countries, and perhaps I'll release a video on this topic very soon. But that era is over. America has stepped back from its role of global hegemon. The world has entered an era of multipolarity, and countries like Russia and China, and America, may be more willing to flex their might and take over lesser countries in their orbit. None of this looks pretty. But I think by educating ourselves about it, we may be better able to deal with it when it comes, as it's coming. We may one day see another shift back towards liberalism. These things happen in cycles, but I just don't see it happening for a very long time. Guys, many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, then do give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, subscribe. World Order covers all things geopolitics, and I also produce stories where I take famous geopolitical figures and retell their tales as epic works of action, adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, and opera. I've got my first new one coming out in a couple months' time. It'll be on Richard Nixon, and I cannot wait. I'm so excited for this kind of cinematic thing that I've got and that I'm going to start releasing. Guys, do hit the bell icon, stay up to date with all that. Feel free to follow me on all available social media. I'll leave them in the description below. Thanks again, and I really hope to hear from you all in the comments below. Take care.